Hey comrades, did you know capitalism always ends in monopoly?
So once again, the United States proves socialists right.
Don't believe me? Almost all banking and finance is dominated by four companies. Almost every commercial food brand is owned by nine companies. 90% of the media in the US is controlled by six companies. Four companies account for 80% of all US drugstores. All air travel in the US is dominated by four companies. Almost all meat is produced by three companies. Almost all beer worldwide is owned by five companies, with two companies dominating 65% of the US beer market. People like to think that capitalism means competition and small business, but history shows something different. Competition is the enemy of the capitalist. Competition between firms is supposed to bring the cost of commodities to their lowest possible level. That means decreased profit every single year, the more competition there is in a particular industry. But capitalism is a productive system based on profit. In this way, eliminating competition is part and parcel to the inherent dynamics of capitalism. This means the capitalist needs to manufacture monopoly, either through branding, eliminating their competition, or simply just merging with other major corporations.
So this TikTok by Comrade Workwear highlights the fact that capitalism has this innate tendency to move towards monopoly, which is something that socialists have been pointing out for a very long time now. In fact, the greatest socialist thinkers in history all tended to point out one reality, which is the socialization of labor. And it is a process that happens under capitalism, because think about it, if you're a business owner and you accumulate more money than other people, you will use that money to then go invest in other businesses so that you can control increasing amounts of market share. And eventually it gets to the point where you start to see increased efficiency as a result of the economies of scale that allows you to then get even more market share. And that system can only lead to a system where you have an eventual monopoly. Now, in the United States, of course, there are laws to prevent outright monopolies in a lot of different industries. So capitalists in the United States have to rely on the next best thing, which is an oligopoly. But even then, that doesn't really tell you the true nature of how bad things really are. Because the reality is, at a certain point of market consolidation, capitalists, instead of competing with each other, can get to a point where they start to view themselves as a class and compete against workers in general. Instead of there being competition within the market, it's kind of the competition between the market and workers. Because in the United States, capitalists have made this very fancy invention called the stock market, where if you're an incredibly wealthy person, you are not going to invest in just one company, but you are going to invest in basically all of them at the same time. And when that's the reality, and those are the people voting in boards of directors and CEOs for giant corporations, the incentive then becomes not one of focused around competition or price wars or anything like that. Then all of a sudden, the incentive just becomes to maximize profit and to do so by increasing relative power over the labor force. And not just the labor force inside of the United States, but the labor force globally, which is why, as an aside, the United States spends so much money on the military and actively destabilizes countries around the world so that we have cheap labor that these giant companies can profit off of. But this is something that socialist theorists talked about a lot, which is the socialization of labor. More and more people are becoming either employees or independent contractors who work for these giant corporations. And these capitalists fundamentally are not interested in competing with each other, they're interested in suppressing workers. And this is why people like Karl Marx predicted that socialism was fundamentally inevitable, because as less and less people were actual business owners and had the opportunity to own their own business, more people would adopt the mindset of proletariat workers. And as workers would start to form unions and would start to support labor rights and things like that, and that this would fundamentally lead to massive social change about the way people view the world. And when you pair that with the rise of monopolistic powers, people would start to come to the conclusion that if everything is all under just a handful of companies anyway, why not just nationalize it so that we can control it democratically? Now, obviously, different socialist countries haven't panned out exactly like that, but this idea of capitalist institutions, by their very nature, socializing labor, that is, collectivizing the work that we do for a sole purpose, socialist countries around the world have kind of used that a little bit to develop their economies. Just look at China, for example, which allowed a lot of capitalist development, but they did it under the supervision of the state. They recognized realize that there's value in some capitalist development to socialize labor, to collectivize workplaces. The key difference being that under capitalism, the monopolistic powers are maintained, and just a small handful of oligarchs are allowed to take in all of the profit. Whereas in a socialist system, things tend to get nationalized so that everybody can collectively benefit from the profit. So all of this is to fundamentally say that the whole myth really depends on everybody believing that pyramid schemes can keep on going forever. It fundamentally depends on the idea that everybody believes that they can be the billionaire at the top, which would require an infinitely increasing population of people to work for this infinite number of business owners. Fundamentally, it doesn't make any sense. So the reality is, if it's your dream to become a business owner, your best bet is under a socialist system and to be a part owner as a worker cooperative. And the good news is, if you look at socialist countries, you'll realize that not only are there a lot of worker cooperatives, but there's also a pretty decent amount of small family businesses as well. It's just that they're not allowed to grow into giant mega corporations.